Opposition leader Olive Crane spoke to the media this morning about the Public Interest Disclosure Act. It's also referred to as whistleblower legislation. It was meant to protect people who work for government and report wrongdoing. Joining me now is David Hutton. He's with the charity organization that helped fine-tune PEI's legislation. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Okay, first of all, why is this type of legislation needed?
Well, whistleblower protection is the single most effective means of combating corruption, incompetence, mismanagement in government or in corporations.
And PEI is known for its history of political patronage, where a lot of people might depend on their local MLA or for the government for work or for a contract. So what kinds of problems does that pose with this legislation?
Well, this legislation, in a small jurisdiction like this, it's very common for relationships to be very important and for patronage to occur, like you mentioned. What this legislation will do is empower employees who see actions that are questionable or wrongdoing to speak out with some protection against reprisals. It's virtually impossible to protect whistleblowers completely from reprisals, but this legislation gives them a fighting chance. So it's not a suicide mission to try and expose wrongdoing.
Right.
You do have a fighting chance of surviving the experience.
Okay. And briefly, there is a clause in here about no reprisals. What kinds of reprisals would that cover?
Oh, well, the range of reprisals that are taken against whistleblowers, and that this has to try and prevent, ranges from isolation, harassment, manufacturing of a poor job performance record, right through to dismissing them. The range of reprisals taken against whistleblowers is really just limited by the imagination of the people that do this, and many of them suffer mental injury because of that, like post-traumatic stress syndrome. So the legislation aims to provide broad coverage that virtually any type of reprisal would be a wrongdoing by that person orchestrating it.
That must be kind of difficult to gauge or police, I guess, because a lot of reprisals are not necessarily overt. They may not be a dismissal. It could be more subtle than that.
No, that's right, and that is one of the issues that the legislation deals with quite well, actually, and that is that it's virtually impossible for an employee to prove reprisal because the employer has all the information, and a lot of it may not be overt. But if the employee can prove that there's a connection, a reasonable probability of a connection between the actions against them and their whistleblowing, then the onus switches on to the employer to prove that it was not a reprisal. And that's a very powerful part of the legislation, and one that we are very glad to see was in there.
Even with this legislation, you mentioned mental stress and so on. Why is it, even with this legislation, why is it still difficult for whistleblowers to come forward? Well,
you're basically pitting yourself against the entire resources of a government department or a corporation, and you may already, when you embark on this, you probably don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of resources, so it's a tremendously unequal battle. And so without strong legislation, most whistleblowers have no chance whatsoever. They're simply crushed and silenced. With the legislation, they have a fighting chance. In the best jurisdictions around the world, whistleblowers will win their cases of reprisal about 20% of the time. You know, so it's always going to be a very dangerous and risky thing to do, but good legislation gives them a fighting chance.
Okay. Briefly, the federal government has had legislation for about 2 years now.
Yes.
How does this legislation compare to the federal legislation?
Oh, it's much better, yeah. In fact, we're in the process of studying legislation across Canada at the provincial level now. We haven't completed that. But the bill, if it's passed, this legislation, I believe, will be by far the strongest legislation in the country, and certainly far ahead of the federal legislation, which is very poor. We testified to Parliament when it was being debated and pointed out the flaws, and our predictions have been proven right. It's really been a very severe disappointment.
Okay. Well, David Hutton, thanks for coming in today. And David Hutton is with a charity organization called the Federal Accountability Initiative for Reform, or FAIR. And thanks for your input on our legislation.
You're very welcome. Thank you.